So thank you everyone for joining us for the second edition of our speaker series as part of Summer of Book Fest. My name is Nicole Cook and I'm the Executive Director here at the Western New York Book Art Center. Well, not literally here, but you know, trying times. My co-host today is Rosemary Williams. She's our Education Director at Book Arts, and Rosemary will be collecting your questions and asking them to Becky as we go. So make sure you make good use of that chat box as we're going along today. For those who might be engaging with us for the first time, the Western New York Book Arts Center is an arts and cultural nonprofit devoted to printing and book-related arts. That includes everything from screen print to letterpress, bookbinding, origami, calligraphy, basically everything that encapsulates a printed page. We're located in the heart of downtown Buffalo, and we've been serving our community with virtual programs throughout COVID. So make sure you check out our website, wnybookarts.org, and follow along with all of our great upcoming virtual programs. Today's speaker series is presented by our partners at the Printing Industries Alliance, and Kim Tuzzo is here to share a little bit more about how they champion print as a contemporary medium. Kim?
Thanks, Nicole. I'm with the Printing Industries Alliance, and we're so happy to partner with the Book Arts on the speaker series, featuring 4 of our upstate members and their artistry. Our PIA member services include human resources, safety training, and group discounts provided to our printer members located throughout New York State, Northern New Jersey, and Erie, Pennsylvania. PIA is also an advocate for the printing industry, promoting print as the media of choice through our Print Drives America Foundation. Looking forward to today's presentation and hearing from Becky and her crew. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Kim. And with that, I am very excited to introduce today's speaker, Becky Almeter, who is here to teach us about the age-old process of intaglio printing. Becky is an owner and president of Hodgins Engraving Co., Whitman Printing LLC, and Tag Print Shop. She is the 3rd generation of printers in her family, carrying on a business started by her grandfather, John Hodgins, in the barn of their family farm with a used Heidelberg letterpress in 1957. Since those early days, the family business has evolved to include a variety of types of printing and related services that the companies offer today. Becky holds degrees in international relations and Spanish, which were fun and informative to learn about, but never really put to use in a career setting. After roaming around the South for a while, she returned to Batavia, New York to join the family business in 2007. Since then, she's worked in all areas of the print shop, including production, shipping, customer service, marketing, we all wear many hats, and found herself taking over for her father officially in 2017 when he retired. Her husband, Jeremy, also works in the business as a production manager and chief die maker. They have 4 children and somehow also run a small farm on the side. And when Becky is not in the print shop or taking care of daily life at home, she likes to steal quiet moments for walking, biking, skiing, reading, and napping. Becky, take us away.
Thank you, Nicole. I didn't realize you were going to mention all that, but thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be able to share a little bit of what we do with everybody, so thanks for joining. I'll jump right in and get started. And the first thing I want to start with is I'm going to show you some samples of actual prints that we make here in our shop and some of the dies that we make to go with them before I go into a PowerPoint about some detail. And without further ado, I'm going to start with a copper die just to get a visual on some of the current modern procedures in the process of intaglio done with a copper die. And I also, I know a lot of people are familiar with other types of specialty printing like letterpress and embossing. So I want to highlight some of the differences with intaglio or engraving as opposed to letterpress. So this is a letterpress die. This is a wood-mounted letterpress die, which is type high. I'm assuming a lot of people in the book arts community are very familiar with this, but it means the type is sticking up off of the die and the die pushes into the paper, in contrast with intaglio where the image is etched into the surface of the die. Okay. There's also, I'll show an example of an embossing die, magnesium and counter, and the embossing die contrasts with intaglio because embossing die and counter is a male-female that the paper is squished in between to sort of make a 3D shape. And the other things I'm going to show is just a little bit, I'm not sure how well these will show on camera, but I'm going to show a few products that are produced with engraving or intaglio. The first is a nice little note card that we've recently done, multicolor, and it's got gold engraving, our Intaglio, as well. We did a lot of different color combinations. It's a bit hard to show. You really need to get samples in your hands. If anyone's interested in samples, my contact information will be up at the end. Feel free to message me, email me, and I'll get you some actual samples in your hand. That's really the only way that you can get a feel for what this is. Here's a wedding invitation piece where the back is, well, both sides are done with Intaglio printing, okay? Double-sided. And then a couple of other examples of different types of products are diplomas. We do all different types of certificates and diplomas, and it often includes some element of engraving or Intaglio. So here's a couple of samples. I'm not really sure how well you're able to see these. And then business stationery. And so we have a lot of different types of business stationery that we produce with Intaglio printing. I'll just show a couple more and then we'll get started with some other things. Okay, there's a gold and black. And one last letterhead. It's got a little splash of color in it. It's produced with Intaglio also. So I'll get started. Rosemary, do you want to switch me over to share my screen and I'll do the PowerPoint? Let's see. Actually, I think I can do this here. Okay. Okay. Bear with me, everybody. I'm just getting the PowerPoint started. Can everyone see my screen okay? Okay. So to just give you a further introduction about my embossing, letterpressing, in addition to engraving or Intaglio. So today I'm just going to talk about Intaglio, but the other thing to mention is that Intaglio has a long history in the artistic community, and it's something that is got a couple different applications. The thing that I'm most familiar with and what I'm going to talk about today is the commercial production of Intaglio. So one of the first things I want to go into is some of the terminology around it, because it can get confusing, and there's many different terms that are multi-purpose. So around the etching process itself, Intaglio is the original Italian pronunciation of this process, Intaglio. It has been westernized with a G pronounced sometimes to be called Intaglio. It's the same thing as engraving. And the etching process is also called photo engraving in the modern way that we do it today. The press itself can be called an engraving press, a die stamping press, or an Intaglio press. The copper piece that has the etched image can be either called a die or a plate. And then the end product can be referred to as Intaglio prints or engraved stationery. So Intaglio printing, as I'm going to refer to it today, just for consistency's sake, actually was started around 1430, and it evolved from goldsmiths and metal workers that etched directly into metal. Later that century, they emerged with a different technique where they etched into a coating on top of metal instead of right into the metal, which has evolved further, but is similar to what we do today. Today, the process of creating the die excuse me. The process of creating the die is done by etching into the top of a photosensitive layer on top of the copper, which I will go into more detail. The cool thing about engraving is that these presses that we use to make the image have not, there's not any modern technology or new updates coming out for them. They're done in the same way that they were done for centuries, basically with some tweaks, but the actual process and the way the image is created has remained the same, and that's what makes it unique. I'm sorry, bear with me here just a moment. This is a photo of an original Intaglio press. This one was from the late 1800s. It was manufactured in New York. And it can be found on the printmuseum.org website, which is the International Printing Museum out in California. There's some more information about it there. This is a sample of a press that we use today. And I'm going to run through the basics of how the press works. The copper die is mounted basically upside down, and a counter is mounted on the top and stamps down into the die. There's also ink that's applied into the die, and the paper is stamped in between the die and the counter. Here's a very rough illustration of that process. And I'm going to break it down to show you kind of what the difference is and why Intaglio is unique here. So the yellow at the bottom is an indication of the die. The ink is wiped onto the die, and the ink sits in the wells of the die. The paper is then inserted on top of the ink, and the counter is the gray part on top that comes down into the paper. So on the bottom illustration, you'll see it all pushed together. This is what it looks like when the press stamps the paper into the die. And the important part here, this is what makes Intaglio unique, and this is where the magic happens, is that this counter has to be cut to fit the die exactly. When the press comes down to stamp the counter into the die, it creates a seal. It seals the ink in the wells of the die, and it actually breaks the fibers of the paper. And the ink it soaks into the fibers of the paper, so it becomes. So this is what makes the process of Intaglio look so unique as opposed to other print processes. And it also is why it's secure. It's why they use it to make currency and other secure papers and documents. So I'm going to switch over to my browser to show you guys a video right now. I'm going to show you a video that walks through the whole process of artwork file to creating a die, to setting up an on-press, and to running the press. So bear with me here while I get that video up. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, so this is just a walkthrough of our entire process. The image that you see on the screen was actually hand-drawn by an artist, but it was scanned in and it's manipulated in InDesign. So we are color separating and output a die for each color. And once the artwork is output, we print on film. We print a film negative of the image, which you see here. And that film is laid on a piece of copper that has a photosensitive layer on top. It's exposed and it's etched in acid bath. Right? And when that die is etched, it's cleaned off and made ready for the press. The press is inked. It's part of the setup process is inking the press. And then we cut a counter. And as I mentioned in the last slide, the cutting of the counter is crucial to getting the right pressure to create the printed image. And so I'm going to stop it here to explain this a little bit. When we set up the press, it's a multi-step process that's much too involved to go in detail here, but what we do is we In order to get that counter to fit exactly to the die, the operator takes a stamp of the actual counter board itself, which is this white material with the blue image on it is the counter board. And you'll see here, there's many different ways to make counters, but a lot of times our operators prefer to hand cut the counters. So after the impression is made on the counter board, it's cut out around the image so that only the image is left in the counter. Once that's checked for position, the press is run. So this is the inking mechanism that applies the ink to the die. And then the stamping, each individual sheet of paper is stamped one at a time, one color at a time. Now this shows the hand feeding process. There are some presses that we also, they have auto feeders on them, but this is that image was a hand feed operation. And this is just a close-up of the end product. Okay. I'm hoping this is helpful to explain the process, because it's really tricky to do in a webinar, in a PowerPoint. It's something you kind of have to see. So I'm hoping you guys are following along. And please, if you have any questions, let Rosemary know. Or put it in the chat box rather, and she'll let me know. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the products and applications that Intaglio is used to produce. The things that we're most familiar with here in our shop are business stationery, social stationery, diplomas and awards, and some of the things that include, we do a lot of business cards. The industries served are typically professional industries, legal industries, financial industries, also retail. As far as high-end branding, we do some items like tags for retail products, receipt holders, thank you cards. And then, as I mentioned,
we do have a question.
Sure.
From Kathy Hartman's, with all that handwork, what is the largest quantity you do, and are there limitations?
One question. Sure. So that's a great question. It is it's a relatively slower process as opposed to other printing techniques. Depending on whether it's hand fed or auto fed, and what the image looks like, the rate, the speed on these presses ranges anywhere from 1,000 sheets an hour to maybe 2,500 at the top end. So we can do any quantity. It's just a matter of how long it's going to take. We back in the heyday, maybe 10 years ago, when there was just much more volume of this work, we used to run a letterhead that we would do about 100,000 at a time, and it lasted maybe a year and a half for this client. So it's all, that job was just in our shop for 2.5 months. So it's not really a matter of, there's not a cap on the quantity. It's just a matter of the time it takes. So I hope that answered that question. And
we have 3 more too. I think it was back to the previous slide. What is the counter made of? The gold is raised, but the blue and red are not, with a little emoji.
So yeah, actually all 3 colors were engraved, intaglio printed with a copper die. The level of raise that you get on your image kind of depends on the image area itself and how the dies are made. The purpose of engraving is not to get as high of a raise as possible. If you're looking for that, you want to go with something more like embossing. So the question about the counter, sorry, I have a worse scratch in my throat. The counter board, there's a few different materials that counters can be made out of. The one that I showed in the video that we use here more commonly is called counterboard, which is basically a paper substrate. It's similar to like a chipboard, it's just made out of paper. It's very thick and very dense. We can, sometimes we also use, there's a more of a plastic synthetic type substrate called Delrin that can be used. But the old school operators that do it by hand really like to cut their own counter out of counterboard, which is a paper material. Any other questions right now?
Well, Frank answered one in the chat. There was one from Daniel. It doesn't look like the etching is very deep. Is there a standard depth, or can the depth vary due to different printed levels on the surface of the sheet? And then the counter is often cut by hand. How do they do that with small type?
Good questions. So for the depth of the die, it can vary a little bit. We control the depth by how long the piece of copper is put in the acid bath. And the longer it's in, the deeper it goes. And there is a standard, but we adjust that depending on how thin or thick the lines are, whether there's a solid or a screen. And that's kind of where it's important to have a die maker who is an expert at those things, because that's part of knowing what you're working with. I hope that answered the question, but if the question was basically can there be different depths, the answer is yes.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think Frank answered some other questions in the chat too, so thank you very much, Frank. And there's another question, but that's a little bit more broad, so we can ask that towards the end. Another one from Kathy.
Okay, sounds good. And then I think I was just stating here that we don't, obviously we don't do any type of rotogravure in-house here, but that is another area of production that the government uses to create currency, that other plants use to create security papers. And it's a similar idea, but they use a die that's actually placed on a cylinder. So it's a whole different press, and it's a whole different process that I won't talk about because I don't know about, but that's also part of it. So the next thing I'm going to go into is a little bit about designing for Intaglio. Some of the factors that's important to keep in mind as an artist when you're creating artwork to be produced with Intaglio. And the first one that I'll talk about is image area. And there is more of a limitation than with other print processes. Most common engraving presses or Intaglio presses that you're going to find can fit a die up to 5 inches by 9 inches, which means that your image area has to be slightly less than that. And in addition to the image area, it's important where the image is positioned on the sheet of paper. So it's just the way that the paper has to feed into the press. There isn't a huge area around the die box for the paper to feed. So you can't, for example, take a sheet of paper that's like 11/17, and you can't stamp an image directly in the center of that typically. So you have to, it's something for the printer and we take into consideration when we get a job is the size of the paper, the image area size, and the image area location on the sheet. Now, if you have an image area that's larger than 5 by 9, it can be produced, but the way we do it is that we would break it down into multiple dies and multiple passes typically. Engraving uses a very specific ink that is manufactured just for this process, and it's different for many reasons, but it is water-based ink as opposed to other processes which typically use oil-based inks. And it's also a very opaque ink, so you can stamp a light color on a dark background or a dark paper and it will show up. The color is very vibrant. And the metallic engraving inks are very unique. They have actual metallic particles in them so that it shines up to a very nice silver and nice gold, especially when we add what we call a burnish pass to any metallic color. It makes the gold and the silver shine pretty brilliant. And to somebody maybe not so familiar with the print industry, sometimes we hear people confusing gold engraving with gold foil embossing. Gold engraving or gold intaglio can be similar, but it has its own unique look, and it's something, again, it's hard to describe, but you have to feel it and look at the difference. If anyone would like samples, again, let me know at the end. Aside from being water-based and metallic, the ink manufacturers for engraving make neon ink colors, which you can use individually or mix with other colors, and they're very, very bright and vibrant, and they stand out. They're not even close to any digital toner-based or other inks or offset inks. And we can match most Pantone colors in the Pantone book. And my next slide is a sample of those neon inks. So this is a job we printed with, I think it was 7 colors we did, and it's each color is, there's 1 ink done at a time on the press. So each color was 1 pass, and the end result, you know, the engraving process makes the ink stand up a little bit from the paper, slightly raised, very opaque, and very vibrant. The next thing I'm going to go into here is a little bit about screens and solids. And this is a really important consideration when you're designing for Intaglio. Most prints are made with line art or artwork that can be manipulated into a screen image, which it's sort of hard to describe, but the idea is that the way that the copper dyes transfer the image to the paper, if you have a larger area of ink coverage in your design, the ink will tend to pool in the dye, and it'll produce sort of an uneven surface, which I'll flip to the next slide real quick to show you a very close-up of these 2 images. So the solid, you can see the ink, you can almost see the texture in the ink. It pools and it doesn't lay down evenly. When we make a screen dye, we do that in order to spread the ink out over the surface of the dye so that it gives the final impression more of an even, or the final image more of an even impression.
Becky, we do have a question about the ink. Do you use or recommend a specific brand of ink?
Well, there are only 2 manufacturers in the States, so yes, that produce inks specifically for this process. One is called Buzz Sales Incorporated. They're out by Chicago. And the other one is Cronite, which is located in New Jersey. And Cronite is manufacturer of ink as well as presses for this process. And we use both of their inks. It just depends on what color it is. And so we use both.
And one other question, are there considerations on the type of paper to use?
Yes, I'm getting there.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so I'll just wrap up on screens and solids. Basically, it's a decision that we make on our end when we're making the dye, whether or not we need to screen something or add a screen to a dye. Usually when we have a new design with Intaglio, we'll talk to the designer or the customer about it and say, hey, I think this is a little bit large. We might need to screen it down. Sometimes we run a sample and do a press proof. Paper. So yes, the type of paper you use is important. It's definitely something to consider. What we want to do is we want a paper that will enhance your design and not compete with it. So you want to show ultimately the reason you're using this process is you want to show the qualities of it. You want to show the raise, the opaque ink, the fine lines, the detail. And sometimes if a paper has too much texture, it will take away from a design that has very fine lines or a lot of detail. If the design itself is pretty simple, then a textured paper very well might enhance it. But one consideration with textured papers is if it's a very heavy texture like a linen or a laid finish or a felt, sometimes we have to do what we call an iron pass, which is basically a dry pass stamping the dye without any ink, which effectively sort of irons out the paper in the area that you're going to be stamping the ink into so that the ink will adhere better. And that's not a problem. It just is an extra pass in production. The a lot of very common paper that people like to use for things like social stationery or wedding invitation is a high cotton content paper, like a Crane's paper. It does show the engraving or the intaglio print very well, and it's also just got a very luxurious, nice feel. So some tips for file setup, if we're, if any designers or pre-press folks are listening and wondering about this, they can be found really on our website, tagprintshop.com. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I'm just going to hit on a couple of important ones here. Everything is done in spot colors. So the press does one color at a time, and there's no CMYK or process color with Intaglio. So you have to make sure when you're setting up the file to make everything in spot colors and the uncoated Pantone color palette. The other important thing to note here is the minimum line width recommended for all Intaglio elements is 0.4 points. And so we're talking about the actual individual line width. That's what's recommended for the best outcome of the die. If you have something that's lighter than that or finer than that, it's possible. It's just, it's not guaranteed that it's going to etch well. So we usually work with a customer and do a sample or a test at that point. Okay. Again, you can find all of these on our website. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Tag Print Shop, which is a newer project for me. And it's basically a passion project that I've been working on, and I got put on the back burner for about 1.5 years. I guess one of the silver linings of COVID is you kind of got a little more time to dust off some of these old projects you were sitting on. So that's what I did with Tag. And basically it's, we have one production facility here in Batavia. We do all of our printing and engraving here. But I felt like, with the current state of the engraving, the commercial printing side of engraving has just decreased so drastically in the past 10 years that I feel like, it's something that a lot of the products that we were printing before were commercial. They were geared towards businesses and a lot of business stationery and things like that, where, you guys are very well aware that the letterpress community is very vibrant, and especially in the past 15 or 20 years, letterpress has become almost something where it's a household recognized print method as something being retro and very unique. And I feel like, bringing in Intaglio to people's awareness, especially the design community, will help also kind of promote and preserve this as an industry. So it's there's a lot of information on our website. I go into a lot more detail about what it is, and I have a lot of resources there as far as requesting samples, design tips, and we also have a call for entries where we're looking to work with designers for them to submit artwork that we can then produce with Intaglio. And information and also entry forms are found on the website as well. So it's exciting. We'll see where it goes, and I hope to be able to collaborate with some designers here in the near future. And I believe that's it for me. So I'll just give you my contact information. Again, feel free to reach out anytime. And like I said, I can talk about Intaglio all day, but until you get your hands on it, it's hard to share. So send me an email or give me a call, and I'll send you some sample packets. Or if you're interested in anything in particular, I can send you a sample die or whatever you're looking for. So I guess I'll turn it over to see if there's any questions.
Yes, Becky, we just had a question from Susan. Will you speak to the differences between thermography and Intaglio? How can we identify one process versus the other?
Excellent question. Yeah, so we do produce thermography in our shop as well, so I'm very familiar with it. So thermography is done on an offset press that has a thermography unit attached. And the difference in the printed the printed product is that thermography has raised ink that sits on the surface of the paper. Thermography is produced when thermal powder is added to wet ink and then put through an oven and heated, and the heat basically causes a chemical reaction so that the thermal powder raises the ink. It becomes like a raised resin type ink that sits on top of the paper. There's no impression into the paper. So the difference with, so thermography is raised, but the ink also has a different visual appearance. It doesn't have the opacity, and sometimes thermography can be a little bit glossy or shiny, where engraving inks, at least the non-metallics, are more of a dull, opaque ink. The big difference is that engraving actually stamps the ink into the paper. So what you end up with is a bruise on the back side of the sheet. And that's the main way you can tell the difference. If you're not sure, flip the sheet over. If you can see a bruise where the counter came down and pushed that paper into the die, then it's engraving or intaglio. Thermography will be completely flat on the back of the sheet. So hopefully that helps.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Becky. We have another question from C. Brennan. I know pricing is very project specific, but in general, how much more expensive is this than something like letterpress?
It's actually very similar to letterpress as far as pricing goes. It's hard to give you an idea of a price because most of the engraving jobs we do or intaglio jobs are they're custom specified, with the paper that they would like, and the dimensions of the piece make a big difference as far as what's press size sheet and how many passes and how long the run is going to take. But yes, the pricing is actually pretty similar to letterpress because you have a lot of the same elements. You have a die, you have a press setup and inking and a press cleanup. So from a cost perspective, it's similar to letterpress.
Thank you. Just checking the chat box here. I know we had a couple other questions that folks were asking, but Frank was kind enough to answer some of the technical questions in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Feel free to, if you have any other questions, to pop them in the chat. I'll make sure they get answered. Thank you, Anne, for your patience.
One thing I'll also mention, if people are looking for further resources or information, there is a industry association called the IEGA, the International Engraved Graphics Association. That is, it's an association of people that produce engraving or intaglio, as well as suppliers. And they put this book out quite a few years, I think it was maybe 10 years ago. It's called Design to Touch. And it is basically a textbook all about the process. So it's got samples and it's got the history and breakdown of design. But they sell these on their website. IEGA has a website where they sell these books, and it's awesome. If you are really interested in getting really in depth, I would highly recommend checking this out. And there's also a lot of other resources on their website as well. The other thing that I have here is it's a sample book that I can send these to anyone who wants one. I have a bunch of them, but it has different samples of like sets of things that are produced with engraving or intaglio, as well as different processes. And then in the back, it has a breakdown of what some of the different ink colors look like and whether they're screened or solid, which is what I put in the one slide that I talked about. So I have those I can send to people, but also check out the IEGA.
Thanks, that's a great resource.
Yes.
We did have another question from Harold. Can you give a brief history of Hodgins Engraving?
Sure, absolutely. It's my family business. Hodgins Engraving is basically a branch of a family business that my grandfather started in the 50s. And there's a lot I could go into, but I think I'll try and give a brief version. So he started printing on a Heidelberg letterpress in the 50s, which is the way printing was done at the time. And then his company sort of went through many iterations, and they got into offset printing later, and signs and painting. And then my father started Hodgins Engraving in 1983 when they took over a guy who's going out of business that just etched engravings for other printers. So when Hodgins Engraving started in 1983, all we were doing was etching dies. We didn't have any printing at all. And my father took that piece of the business and sort of went off on his own from the family. And so that was our origins, was a photo engraving company. He started etching zinc and copper back in the day. And then, the technology and the metals have changed a little bit over the years, but we etch magnesium and copper. We also provide photopolymer dyes. But over the years, he added in commercial printing sides. We started getting into offset printing and thermography, and then added some of the specialty processes as well, such as the foil stamping, embossing, letterpress, and then the engraving presses as well.
You always have to adapt as a printer.
Yeah, there's one thing that I know everyone on this call, if you're part of the PA, knows the printing industry is you better adapt to change well.
And a question from Kathy from Quality that kind of bounces back to an earlier question that she had asked. Are you training people to do this work? And then her earlier question was, are you showing kids how to do this work, or the younger generation? If I got that right, Kathy.
That'd be great. That's kind of what I was hoping to get into more with the Tag Print Shop, is collaboration and be a resource so that we can also work with people that are interested in learning about it and how to do it. I don't have anything specific right now as far as like a workshop or anything like that, but I'd love to be able to get into that in the near future. There's a little bit of a safety concern with especially with kids, these engraving presses. Technically, OSHA doesn't even have a way to check us on these things because they're so old, you cannot physically put guards on them. So you have to be careful. There's a lot of letterpress that are hand feed that are similar in that sense, but we have to be careful about safety. And so I personally don't let my kids on the engraving presses, but they're a little young yet. They probably will when they're a little older. But yeah, that's what I intend to do with the Tag Print Shop. Like I said, it's a relatively new project. I'm getting started with trying to get a little bit more collaboration and get out there. And one of the cool things that we did about 1.5 years ago with, as part of the IEGA that I mentioned, the Engraved Graphics Association, went to How Design Conference, which was at the time in Chicago. And we took they provided a engraving press that's basically a tabletop unit that was portable. And they brought it on the show floor, and they actually had people inserting the die, inking the die, making their own impression, and coming away with an engraved printed piece. So we could do something like that for sure in the future, getting out there in community with some workshops and things like that.
Thank you. Thanks. Any other last questions? Pop them in the chat. Oh, we do have a question. Can you talk a little bit more about the call for entries?
Yeah, so basically, we're looking for designers that can work with us to produce artwork that we can print on the engraving press and make. The end goal is to make products that we can put in our marketplace and our website and Etsy to sell. And then basically I envision it working similar to like a Minted or something like that, where it's an artist community that work with a producer to get products out there. The difference is that it's got to be Intaglio print specific, which I think is unique. I don't know if anyone else is doing that. But I envision this call for entries working like we would work with designers who are interested in participating as they go through the design process to make sure the design is going to work well for the print, and then decide also what product it would be best suited for. So some of the things that we're thinking of are note cards, bookmarks, just intaglio prints that you can either put up or frame and put up, and things of that nature, so that working with designers and making sure that the design is on track for the product, And if it works out, having something like a commission-based thing where if the product sells, you know, the designer gets a certain cut of the commission. So the call for entries is actually on the website at tagprintshop.com /call for entries. And there's some forms to download that tell you specifically what we're looking for.
And we also put that link in the chat as well. And more about the process of the printing. Can you engrave something and then run it through a digital device?
Good question. It depends on the device, depends on the digital device. So one of the most common things that we do that for is diplomas. So if we are imprinting, for example, I have the little one here, for imprinting the student's name or graduate's name, it has to be put through a digital device. And we have over the years worked with a few different devices. We've done a lot of trial and error. The short answer is that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. A lot of it depends on the paper. So you have to choose a paper that's going to work well with a toner-based device and work well with the engraving presses. So making sure you're choosing the right paper is important. And we have a press that we're running now for imprinting on diplomas that works really well to feed most things that have embellishments, whether it be intaglio or embossing or thermography. But it has, like I've said, we've been through many iterations of testing different presses. So the answer is yes, most of the time, but it depends on the factors involved in the job.
Thank you. All right. Well, we just have a couple more minutes left. And I know, Becky, you said you already have a real busy day ahead of you, right?
Things have been a little different here in the shop since COVID. So currently production manager, inspector, sometimes shipper, but today we have a lot of things out in the shop, which is a good thing. It's a good thing.
Well, thank you so much. Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say, any last minute questions, I'll continue to monitor the chat. And Becky was kind enough to pop her email in on that last slide too. But if anybody needs to get a hold of her, if they missed that email, feel free to just reach out to us and we can put you in touch.
Okay, I'll just say a quick thank you. I really appreciate you guys having an interest in learning a little bit more about this. And if there's anything I didn't touch on, or like I said, you got to get samples of this. If you're at all interested in it, let us know. We'll get you some samples. Thanks.
Thanks,
you,
Becky. Great presentation.
Thank you so much, Becky. This was really informative. And also, just as a quick plug for Hodgins, we at Book Arts order a number of digital designs on magnesium plates for letterpress printing through Hodgins. And the work is just, I mean, amazing. Everything always comes in on time, perfect quality. You know, we cannot sing their praises enough. So if you're thinking about trying out some alternative process printing, that's definitely the way to go.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to Kim and the Printing Industries Alliance. We're so grateful for all of our PIA members and friends who are on the call today. We love rallying this community of printers around all kinds of different topics. So thanks for joining us. And also AIGA Upstate. I'm not sure how many upstaters we have on the call today, but they were generous enough to help us market this to try to bring designers and printers together over process. So we're really excited about that too. The next talk in our speaker series is next week, Thursday. The rest of these have been a Friday, but this one is a Thursday, so mark your calendar. At 12 p.m. And that's going to feature Denise Santos, who is the head bookbinder at Quality Bindery Services. Kathy Hartman's in the house. So Denise is going to be sharing bookbinding, repairs, cover design, and the ordering process for all of that next week. So make sure if you like what you've seen so far, you join us for that talk too.